Hi, everyone. Welcome to Buildings NY Unlocked. My name is Chaya Molberg. I'm the Vice President and General Manager of Buildings NY, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. Today's session is by Jameson Morse, and it's about facade inspection, Local Law 11. Before introducing Jameson and getting started, however, let me share a few general housekeeping items with you. This session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing for you and your colleagues to reference at a later date. You'll be able to find it through Buildings NY Unlocked website and YouTube channels. Everyone will be muted. If you have a question for the speaker, please use the Q&A box to ask the questions. If we can't get to every question, please don't worry. Your email address is connected through the registration process with your question, and Jameson and his team will be able to follow up with you at a later date directly. Please utilize the chat function if you have any technical issues or questions. My team will be behind the scenes monitoring those. We haven't had any issues so far, but if anything comes up, please let us know and we'll work through it with you. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jameson Morse, Managing Principal of PVE Engineering.
Yep.
You'll see me again when we're ready for questions, but take it away, Jameson.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Jameson Morse. I'm a Managing Principal at PVE Engineering. I'm a professional engineer and a qualified exterior wall inspector, or QE, regularly performing Local Law 11 facade inspections and report filings. Today's topic will be Local Law 11 Facade Inspection Safety Program, abbreviated as FISP, and the Cycle 9 updates and current requirements that went into place earlier this year. So an overview of the presentation, we're going to cover why the Facade Inspection Safety Program was put in place, what buildings are affected and fall under FISP compliance requirements, who can perform these inspections and file Local Law 11 reports, what the inspection itself actually entails, and how recent updates have changed the requirements from Cycle 8 into Cycle 9. So first is just an overview of what FISP is. The Facade Inspection Safety Program is essentially put in place to enable engineers and architects to inspect buildings on a regular interval to ensure public safety for the inhabitants of New York City. So there's a quote here from the New York City Department of Buildings. The department is enhancing qualified exterior wall inspector qualifications, the inspection requirements, and the civil penalties against owners to ensure public safety. Essentially, this all goes towards the common goal of providing a safe environment for the public of New York and making sure the facades that are towering above them on tall buildings are non-hazardous. So that being said, what buildings fall under FISP compliance? It's any building above 6.5 stories. So to illustrate this point, I gave a diagram here of buildings that kind of fall right on that line above and below 6.5 stories. So the building on the left here is just below 6.5 stories and would not be subject to Local Law 11 FISP reporting requirements. It's important to note, however, there's building owners of buildings that fall below the height requirement are still required to maintain their building facade. The only difference is they do not need to file the reports on a regular cycle and perform those inspections. But why this falls under 6.5 stories, you see there's 6 stories above grade, the first through 6th story there, but the basement or cellar, over 50% of that story height is below grade. So you see the exterior grade on there, the basement and cellar, as designated by the code, and counting against FAR, is tied to the curb elevation of the building. In the FISP universe, it's actually the surrounding exterior grade elevation in all areas. So here, The basement and cellar, over 50% of the story height is below grade at all locations, which means this falls under 6.5 stories. If you look at the building on the right, looks about the same building, but you'll notice the grade here is a little bit lower. So the basement cellar, over 50% of the story height is above grade at one or more locations. And then that facade would be above 6.5 stories, and the entire building would then be subject to local law 11 FISP reporting requirements. And it's important to notice not just the facade itself that's above 6.5 stories, the entirety of the building. And all facades are required to be included in the inspection and report once that height requirement is triggered. So who can file these reports? It's the designation of a qualified exterior wall inspector, or shortened as a QE, whom is a registered design professional with at least 7 years of relevant experience with facades over 6 stories in height. So that 7-year requirement is underlined because that's updated from Cycle 9. And an oral interview with the Department of Buildings Facades Unit, as well as documentation verifying and validating that experience, is required for approval as a QE, which gives you the status enabling you to log in to the DOB Now system and actually file those reports. So the 7 years of relevant experience is an increased requirement in Cycle 9, but those professionals that had a valid QE status with the department prior to the start of Cycle 9, if you were filing reports in Cycle 8 and previous, you do not need to sit for an oral or written test to update or maintain your qualifications. You're grandfathered in. So this is only for new QEs applying as of February this year. So when the QE files the report, it basically classifies the building into 3 separate categories. You have safe, swamp, or unsafe. A safe building is a building that, in the judgment of the qualified exterior wall inspector, the building does not have any conditions that would cause it to become unsafe or hazardous during the next 5 years. A swamp building, SWARMP stands for Safe with a Repair and Maintenance Program, means that the building facade has at least one condition, which although is not deemed hazardous at the time of inspection, if it's not repaired within the time frame specified by the QE that's recommended for repair, it may deteriorate into an unsafe condition. And then there's unsafe buildings where the building facade has at least one condition that the QE sees as either an immediate hazard to the public or a condition that if it's not repaired within 12 months could pose a hazard to the public. So that 12 months is important because that's kind of where the separating line is between the SWARMP and unsafe filings. SWARMP, you need to provide that recommended date of this needs to be repaired prior to 5 years in the next cycle, but it will not be accepted as SWARMP if the recommended repair date is within 12 months. That would fall into the unsafe bucket, and that's kind of where that dividing line is. So if we take a look at Cycle 8 that just closed in February of this year, looking at the filing statistics, you'll see about 75% of buildings fell into either the safe or SWARMP category, relatively even split there, 38 and 37%. But 25% of buildings were filed as unsafe, or there was no report filed at all. It's 13% and 12% there respectively. This is a big focus of the department and why these requirements have increased. It's really to incentivize owners with some of the penalties that come along with filing unsafe or not filing reports at all to perform these inspections and to get these compliance reports in to ensure the safety of the public. So if you total all those numbers in Cycle 8, it was about 14,500 or so, but with new, taller buildings going online every day, it's now estimated that approximately 16,000 total buildings will be in the FISP universe that require 9th cycle filings that happened, or that the 9th cycle just started earlier this year. So when do you have to file these reports? The overall 9th cycle is a 5-year span, but it's broken into different subcycles, so not all buildings file at the same time. So as you can see there, there's 3 subcycles, 9A, 9B, and 9C, and they have kind of a staggered 2-year filing window. It's the different subcycles that you fall into are broken up by the last digit of the block number. So for 9A, if your building ends in 4, 5, 6, or 9, the block number, you file during 9A, which opened earlier this year on February 21st and closes February 21st, 2022. 9B, if your block number ends in 0, 7, or 8, starts February 21st, 2021 next year and goes for 2 years till February 21st, 2023. And then 9C, of course, is 1 year after that for buildings with a block number ending in 1, 2, or 3. And that's February 21st, 2022, February 21st, 2024. And then cycle 9 itself extends for 1 year after the 9C deadline and goes till February 20th of 2025. So why that kind of extends there is this is when you need to file to avoid any late penalties. No report filed penalties or late filing penalties you need to file during your designated subcycle, but all buildings need to file a report during cycle 9. Otherwise, after February 20th, 2025, you can no longer file any cycle 9 reports, and there's penalties associated with missing that'll accrue until you are able to submit an acceptable report. So what are the inspection requirements and what do you have to do here and document when you file these reports? So it really focuses on 100% of the exterior walls and appurtenances. So you need to comment and review the type of construction of the building, the age of the material, the building's exposure to environmental conditions, which might be detrimental to the building envelope, the facade's history of maintenance and repairs and repair campaigns that have happened on an ongoing basis, the different building materials that make up the facade and the building envelope, whether it be terracotta, masonry, the brickwork, mortar, metal anchors and supports, the lintels and shelf angles, etc. And then this also encompasses all our appurtenances, which are things connected to the facades, whether that be balconies, the railings, fire escapes and fire escape stairs, awnings, flagpoles, etc. And also you need to comment on the water tightness of the building envelope and the facade. Water infiltration is a leading cause of detrimental effects to facades, and especially in a city like New York where there's a lot of freeze-thaw, that can cause some real issues. So it's up to the QE to then design a compliant inspection program. And it varies kind of case by case for each building based on the different materials, height, geometry of the building, etc. So there may be special or additional inspections or sounding procedures required on certain types of buildings. A good example that's a very focused effort right now is terracotta buildings or brownstone buildings. A lot of decorative terracotta is beautiful, but it's a very brittle material and will require more attention than say like a glass curtain wall building may, because you want to get really 100% hands-on inspection of those terracotta elements if you can to get a really good representative sampling, since a terracotta failure is brittle and pretty immediate, so requires special focus there. And the goal of the inspection program when you're identifying these deficiencies is to try to ascertain the cause of these and the conditions detected. You're not looking to fix the symptom. You're really looking to fix the actual cause so that whenever the repairs are performed, this is not a recurring issue that causes a hazardous environment. So to do that, you have critical inspections, which is from all available vantage points, and you have a physical, hands-on, up-close inspection. This is one of the biggest increases from Cycle 8 and Cycle 9 in the requirements. The previous requirement for the physical examination was 1 physical examination hands-on per building on a street-facing elevation. So that's from grade all the way to roof level continuous. Previously, it was just 1 on a street-facing facade. Now, the new requirement is a minimum of 1 physical examination for every 60 linear feet of facade along a public right-of-way. So the definition in the building code of public right-of-way is a public street, avenue, sidewalk, roadway, or any other public place or public way. And to get some clarification here, how it's really defined is the elevation of a facade is considered part of the public right-of-way if a member of the public who is not associated with the property in question can freely walk up to the facade of the building, even if the facade is on private property. So if you're on the street or sidewalk and you can get to this without some form of physical barrier restricting your entry, that would be considered part of the public right-of-way. So I've included over here the diagram to the right. The orange areas, if you assume that is a gated alleyway with a locking mechanism is important because if it's just the gate that can swing, then that's accessible, but as long as it's lockable, that would count as a physical barrier. That gated alleyway or a private courtyard do not meet the definition of public right-of-way. It would not be part of that 60 linear feet calculation there. The areas in blue is along the street-facing facades, along the public right-of-way there, so that would go into the areas that would be required to fall under the physical examination requirement. So how you calculate the number of drops and where that is does get a little tricky. So thankfully, the building department did put out some clarification here. And these are the exhibits from their frequently asked questions from earlier this year. So how you calculate the number of drops required is you take the total linear footage of the areas that are in the public right-of-way and you divide it by 60. And then you round up to the nearest whole number. So case 1 is pretty standard. Facades there labeled A and B are facing the street and sidewalk. The other facades are facing adjacent buildings, so they are restricted and do not fall under that. So you take the linear footage of A and B and you divide it by 60, and then you round up to the nearest whole number, and that's the minimum number of drops required to satisfy the physical examination requirement. If you look at case 2, this one gets a little bit more complex. You have some jogs, you have some ins and outs of the building, and it shows out there the public sidewalks out near the street, and you have private property from the property line in. However, since there's no physical barrier preventing people from that public sidewalk to kind of get up to that facade, the elevations labeled A, B, C, D, and E there all fall under the physical examination requirement and are considered part of the public right-of-way. So the fence there is a physical barrier and the other facades do not fall under that requirement. So you take the total linear footage of all of those jogs of A through E and you divide it by 60, round up to the nearest whole number, and that is the minimum number of drops required. It's also important to note that where you locate these drops, once you determine the minimum number, you can't cluster them. You're supposed to spread them out to really get a good representative sampling across the entirety of the facade. So you want to space them out, try not to space them more than 60 linear feet apart from each other, but also locate them that you're going to get a good representative sampling of not only the different materiality that may make up the facade, but different conditions as well. And if you see kind of areas that seem a little suspect, that's where you're going to want to perform that up-close inspection because we really want to investigate what's going on there. Now, case 3 is a little bit interesting because a lot of buildings out there have only one portion of the building that may exceed that 6.5-story requirement, or that height that we talked about before, and it might have a shorter portion. So case 3 here has a 2-story section of the building, but then there's a tower that exceeds 6.5 stories. For the physical examination, you take the linear footage of the facades that are above the 6.5 stories, divide that by 60, and round up to get your number of physical examinations. And the 2-story section of building facade is not, the linear footage of that facade is not counted towards that calculation. It is important to note, though, the condition of the entire building, as we discussed before, is still required to be inspected and noted upon. It's just the physical examinations that are required on the taller portions of those buildings. So another requirement that's kind of added to this physical examination is you need to have a dated photographic documentation included in the supporting documents that shows the QE or their delegated individual actually performing the hands-on physical exam uploaded. So this picture, you can take it as a selfie. It's kind of recommended that someone else can take that picture for you so that you can be focusing on that. So a contractor can take, these pictures, but we really want to have some photographic evidence of the up-close inspection being performed and ensure that those photographs are dated so it can be time-stamped, knowing when that inspection was performed. Inspections are able to be carried out by individuals other than the QE under certain circumstances, but it's important to note that the full and final responsibility of the filed FISP report relies solely on the professional QE who's turning in the report under their name. One other item with the kind of robust increased requirements of the physical examination, it was always required that the up-close was needed to be performed within 1 year of the report submission date. But with the addition of all these drops, only the final close-up inspection is required to be within the 1-year time frame, as long as the full hands-on physical examination requirements were met within a reasonable time frame prior to that final inspection. So this determination is kind of handled on a case-by-case basis, and as always, is at the sole discretion of the Department of Building. So if you're unsure, you can get them to weigh in on it. But essentially what this means is if you just performed a very robust repair campaign and you satisfied the up-close requirements and the number with the every 60 linear feet during that, but you found some repairs that kind of took longer, the entire inspection requirements doesn't have to be within 1 year. Only the completion of the inspection requirement, or that up-close inspection, has to be within the 1 year, which would be that final inspection. So typically a reasonable time frame is within the same filing cycle, or around 5 years. However, it is case by case, so if there's any clarity required there, it's recommended to contact the facades unit at the Department of Buildings. Another big change starting in cycle 9 is the requirement of cavity wall probes. So starting in cycle 9, in all odd cycles, it will require probes to be performed at every one of those up-close physical examination locations if your building is a cavity wall building. So the definition of a cavity wall is an exterior wall system consisting of an exterior veneer with a backup wall, whereby the exterior veneer relies on a grid of metal ties to the backup wall for lateral stability. 2 layers of the wall are separated by an air cavity, which may or may not be filled with insulation. So the diagram there to the right shows a cavity wall, and essentially you have that cavity that's being spanned and the veneer is being tied back by these metal ties. So these cavity wall probes are intended so that a representative quantity of the ties can be exposed So the QE can report on the presence, condition, and spacing of the ties, as well as the shelf angles, the substrate material, and all other components of the wall assembly, and really get a good understanding of what's going on behind there. The QE is now required to provide a statement regarding the condition of the wall cavity assembly and the ties, and if the observed ties met the relevant code at the time of construction. So why this is important is because you can have some pretty catastrophic failures if those ties are degraded. Here's an example where the spacing and the presence of the ties were much lower than they were required to be. The lateral stability of the wall was compromised, and once it failed, entire panels between the shelf angles, which was entire floor height of brick, just kind of let go and collapsed. So getting an understanding of the condition of these wall ties and the spacing and just their very existence is very important. A popular question with all of these new probing requirements is, does the probing of a cavity wall require a permit and a sidewalk shed? So, per RCNY 10114, Table 9, Item 1, probes involving the removal of less than 10 square feet of unit masonry with a maximum dimension not to exceed 4 feet in any direction in any 100 square feet of wall area where the cumulative area of all probe openings on all facades does not exceed 150 square feet, the probe would not require a DOB work permit. So the intent is that most of the probes that would be required under this new requirement would likely fall under this, where it would not necessarily require a DOB work permit because it would fall under the limits prescribed. This type of work may also not require a sidewalk shed if the facade material in its current state is deemed by the QE able to handle a probe without destabilization, and adequate precautions are taken below the area of work, such as blocking off the area below, having flagmen at street level, and properly redirecting pedestrian traffic when the probing occurs. That being said, proper safety precautions are always required, and coordination with landmarks is also required if applicable, if you are a landmark building, changing bricks and mortar and whatnot. And when the facade conditions being probed are suspect, or are in areas over heavy pedestrian traffic, or fall in areas over entrance egress doorways, etc., they may be subject to enhanced safety measures, including but not limited to sidewalk shed installation. So kind of in summary, a permit and a sidewalk shed is not always required, but that doesn't mean that they're never required. It's really, if you're probing in an area that looks suspect because the wall may be bowing, you're going to want to make sure that you take the proper safety precautions, especially if it's in a heavily trafficked area or over egress, or an egress doorway. But if there's any uncertainty on this, it's always recommended to reach out to the building department prior to performing a repair campaign, as it's always up to the department's discretion. Another popular question on this is there any exception to the probing requirements? And the answer is yes. There's three different ways that it can be waived, and that is when a repair campaign addressing the cavity wall ties have been completed within 10 years of the filing deadline, and the owner or the QE provides proof of such repairs, such as photos, inspection reports, construction documents, etc. If you can submit that, then you may be able to have the probing requirement waived. Similarly, if it's a pretty new building and the first temporary certificate of occupancy or certificate of occupancy was issued within 10 years of the filing deadline, and proof of the proper wall tie installation is provided, again with photos, reports, construction documents, etc., from this requirement. And the third one is if an alternate method of determining wall tie spacing is proposed by the QE and accepted, so it has to be accepted prior by the Department of Buildings, you can be waived of that requirement. So you can use other methods of detection of the wall ties, but you need to ensure that whichever method you choose, you can satisfy all of the inspection requirements and the asks to kind of qualify the information that needs to be submitted regarding the wall tie spacing and condition. So now when we get to what's actually required after you perform these inspections and turning in the report, a mapping of all of the conditions is a requirement whenever you're submitting these items. So conditions noted during the inspection must be mapped on either elevation drawings, marked up elevation photographs, or a combination of both, as long as they can provide a clear depiction of the type and location of all the facade conditions noted. So here you see an elevation photograph. There's a bunch of different items that are kind of mapped there. And then there's a legend on the side that says, look, here's the elevation, here's the different locations of all of the items that we saw, and here are the different types of deficiencies that we saw in those areas. Many a time you'll see that we'll attach photos to the different areas as well, so it kind of provides a photo key that you can match the location and type of condition to a photo up close, kind of depicting that item as well. The reports are then, all the information from the inspection is then filed by the QE online by filling out information in the form-based web application through the DOB Now Facades portal. So a little screenshot of one of the screens is there on the right. You need to fill out all the information on those various tabs and upload supporting documents as required. Owners and their representatives must also have an account on DOB Now and log in to sign off with their acceptance prior to the QE being able to submit the report. Safe reports, as an updated requirement in Cycle 9, must have a minimum of 3 condition photos specific to facade elements that represent typical conditions. And these photos are separate and in addition to the required elevation photographs. So now, whether it be a cornice or lintels or windowsills, you need to have kind of a representative photograph, even if your filing is safe, as kind of what those buildings are look like outside of just the overall elevation photographs. Cavity walls, as we discussed before, they'll require additional photos as a supporting document to show the state of the existing structure, along with the QE's commentary on the condition of the cavity wall and wall ties. And if you do file as unsafe, items must be repaired within 90 days. And if they cannot be, then you need to file FISP 1 and FISP 2 extension requests to ensure that your building stays within compliance. And kind of a little bit more on that, per the latest revision to the facade rule, RCNY 10304, which is local law 11, and effective February 20th this year, an unsafe recommended date represents the recommended time frame for repairs to be performed to bring the building to swarm or a safe status. So if you're filing this as unsafe, you need to give an unsafe recommended date, which these things need to be repaired to at least bring it to swarm, if not safe. And that date that you provide indicates the date which the work will be completed. This is not the date when recommendations were issued or the inspection was conducted, but the date that the repairs must be completed, indicated and recommended by the QE. So a FISP report with an unsafe status cannot be filed without an unsafe recommended date, and time extension requests are required to be filed every 90 days until reaching that recommended date. You will now not be allowed to file time extension requests, which are FISP 1s or FISP 2s, that extend beyond the unsafe recommended date. So if you're filing these extensions and you're not going to meet the recommended unsafe date, then you now need to file a subsequent report in order to change an unsafe recommended date or a swarm recommended date. If you're filing to change those dates, you need to file now a subsequent report indicating revised conditions and kind of reasoning of why that recommended date has changed. Another one of the requirements now is that whenever you file and get an accepted report, you must download and display your FISP certificate. So these certificates must be displayed in building lobbies, similar to what's done with elevator inspections or the new local law 95 energy grades, or the restaurant health grades. These certificates can be downloaded through the DOB Now Façades portal. So you as an owner or manager has an account, you can download this, or you can ask the QE that filed the report for you. So what are the filing fees that are associated with filing these reports? The initial report filing fee, these are new as of cycle 9, have been updated to $425 for the initial report. And then if you're filing an amended or subsequent report, an amended would be if you filed as unsafe and you're amending the condition to either swarm or safe, and a subsequent would be if you filed an accepted report as either as likely swarm, and you're just filing another swarm or safe report, that would also be $425. So really the report filing fees themselves are $425, and if you're filing an extension request every 90 days there for an unsafe building, that would be a $305 filing fee. And those fees can be paid just through DOB Now and the Façades portal for your report. There's just a little tab on the side there that you can pay by credit card right through the website itself. Now, what happens if you do not file or you're found to be not compliant with FISP? Are the civil penalties, and these have increased pretty substantially from cycle 8 to cycle 9. The first one is if you're late filing, if you did not file your report within those deadlines and your subcycle deadlines that we have listed there, you're subjected to a late penalty on a monthly basis. The previous civil penalty for a late filing was $250 a month. The new civil penalty for late filing is $1,000 a month. So that went up pretty considerably. And these fines would continue to accrue after missing the deadline of filing until an acceptable report is filed. So the clarification there is whenever you file the report, the penalties that would be accruing would stop and be put on pause, but the report would have to be acceptable. So the report will be reviewed after that. And if it's accepted, then the date that you originally filed is when those penalties would stop accruing. If the report is rejected, typically you have some comments and you have to respond within 45 days to keep the initial filing date. If you fail to respond within those 45 days or are rejected, multiple times where it's just fully rejected, you lose that filing date, and then the penalties would unpause and accrue up to the current date. So it's important to make sure that you're filing on time in order to avoid these penalties. And whenever you do file, make sure that you respond timely to any comments that you may get to ensure that the building or the inspection report ultimately does get accepted. The other big civil penalty with this is the failure to file a report overall. The civil penalty previously was $1,000. It has been increased fivefold up to $5,000. So this penalty is assessed annually on the anniversary of the filing deadline that was missed. So if you kind of do the math there, if you did not file a report by the filing deadline, by 1 year later, you will be hit with not only the $5,000 failure to report, but you will have been hit with $1,000 a month all the way up to that. So that would total $17,000 of penalties for a report that's not filed by 1 year after its designated filing deadline. So very important, because those fines are incredibly steeper than the filing fees that we went over, $425. So you can save a lot of money by getting those reports in on time and being compliant. Another of the updates in cycle 9 was a modification to the civil penalties if you fail to correct an unsafe condition. So this would be if you filed the report unsafe and you have a sidewalk shed up, but you did not continue to file extensions or did not provide substantial evidence of why an extension would be necessary and had been denied an extension. Well, the penalty there is $1,000 a month for the first year. If you have a sidewalk shed up, as you should if you had filed unsafe, then in year 2, you not only have that base penalty of $1,000 a month, but you get tacked on an additional $10 for every linear foot of sidewalk shed you have erected as well. Year 3, that linear foot of sidewalk shed penalty increases another $10 to $20 a linear foot, still with the base penalty of $1,000 a month. And 4, it increases again, and year 5, it increases again. So what this is trying to do is, if you file unsafe, simply putting up a sidewalk shed and not actually moving forward with the corrections is not acceptable, and you will be penalized pretty heavily for doing that if you're not making adequate progress towards actually correcting the conditions and making the building safe. The last new penalty here that's kind of different from cycle 8 is that now if you do not correct a swarm condition from the previous cycle, it automatically becomes unsafe. That has not changed, and that has been a requirement for a few cycles now. In cycle 9, you will now be assessed a $2,000 penalty if you filed administratively unsafe for failure to repair a condition that was noted as swamped in the previous cycle. So as you can see, the penalties have increased pretty substantially from cycle 8 to cycle 9, as have the qualifications for the inspectors that can perform these investigations and file these reports, and the requirements of the inspections themselves. So it's there's a lot of information out there, and I hope to have covered a lot of it, but I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. So I will now turn it back over and answer any questions that may have come in, and appreciate the time.
Sorry, y'all, I was muted. Thank you, Jameson, so much. There was so much great information, and we do have a number of questions we can go through. I'll volley them to you kind of
Sure.
After they came in, if you don't mind. Although I feel like I really should have titled this session, How to Avoid $17,000 worth of penalties. I mean, just right there, that slide at the end with, was so impactful, and everything that you're saying leads directly to the building owners and property managers' bottom line, which is what we've been talking about. So a few questions that we have here, and if people have some, please feel free to continue to type them in the Q&A box. What we do not get to now, Jameson and his team will still be able to answer at a later date. So Jameson, who can be a delegated individual performing an inspection if they're not a QE?
Oh, good question. So if you're not a QE, you can perform an inspection as a delegated individual under the supervision of a QE. As a professional or a registered architect or a professional engineer, or an individual with a bachelor's degree in architecture or engineering and 3 years of relevant FISP inspection experience. Otherwise, if you're an individual that has 5 years of relevant FISP inspection experience, as long as you're working directly under the QE's direct supervision, you can perform those inspections. And I'm actually reading that directly out of the code because which I have in front of me. So that can be found and is pretty well documented there. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you need to wait for your subcycle to file unsafe?
No, that is a great question. You can file an unsafe report at any time. The one qualification there is that it needs to actually be unsafe. If you're just trying to file just to file, it will not be accepted, and that is frowned upon, and you will probably be reprimanded as a QE. So absolutely do not recommend doing that. However, if you do have a hazardous condition that qualifies the building as unsafe, you do not need to wait for your subcycle to open. You can file that unsafe report at any time. That will start, that 90 days for repair and whatever extensions. And if you then perform all of those repairs and bring the building to safe, you can file the amended report to that unsafe filing at any time as well to attach that. So really the subcycles are for buildings filing as swarm or safe, but if it's unsafe, file it. You can file it at any time within the cycle.
Thank you. I think this kind of piggybacks on that. So do amended reports or subsequent reports require another full inspection procedure?
No. So the inspection procedure with all of the physical examination requirements and all of those drops only has to happen once within the filing cycle. So if you file it as either swarm or unsafe and you perform the full inspection procedure, you had some areas that you had to repair, as long as that initial filing had the full inspection procedure satisfied, if you perform the repairs and you only had to drop, in that area to perform those repairs, you can file an amended or subsequent report without having to remobilize for the entirety of the inspections. So that requirement just has to be satisfied once during the overall inspection cycle.
Thank you. And Peter has a question. Does the Department of Buildings, the DOB, have a mechanism in place for identifying if a 6-story building with a greater than 50% basement cellar has never participated in FISP?
So there is a height check that you can go through the DOB Now portal if you are unsure, or if you feel that it either does or does not qualify, and submit that as a professional. As far as the city itself, they're not going out actively looking for buildings to see if they qualify or not. However, if the inspector for some reason might be on site for another issue, particularly if it is a facade issue, and for like a violation type of failure to maintain situation, and they see that the building has a facade that would be above that 6.5 stories, then it's likely that they may trigger and then enter that building into the system. So there's no one really actively looking out there, but if they do happen to come upon that, then especially for a facade related issue that brought them to the site, there is a chance that the building would then be entered into the FISP universe if it had not previously been entered.
So follow-up question from the same attendee, which I think kind of correlates. Are there any updates on the use of drones for these inspections?
So drones can be used for the critical inspections to get views from all available vantage points. They currently do not replace the hands-on physical inspection requirements. So you can use them to inspect. It is pretty incredible what drone technology can do now with some of those high-res photographs. But the physical hands-on inspection requirements are not only to get a good visual that you can't see from street facing, especially on some of these taller buildings, but it's really to get a hands-on, to sound some of these materials and make sure things aren't loose or hazardous, which currently drones cannot really replace at this point.
So also then it looks like since we're on kind of the inspection process, Steve has two questions that I think also hit this point. While you're on it, Jameson, please. Now that you have to perform a probe, will you cause damage as previously a visual was acceptable? And then second to that, can you do an inspection from balconies as was previously approved?
So, I mean, probing, obviously the intent is not to damage the building. However, you do need to open up and somehow ascertain the condition of the wall ties. So one of the waivers to that requirement was submitting an alternate form of inspection to kind of get that information. And that has to be previously approved by the buildings department before it's accepted. But otherwise, you do need to find some form of probe to inspect that behind there. And I see another question that I'm just going to pull into this about borescopes, because that's a great question. Borescopes are allowed to be used. It's just you need to make sure that you can satisfy all of the items that you need to answer on regarding the wall ties. So that's the full condition of the wall ties themselves, if they're degraded in any way, shape, or form, what the spacing is over the course of a representative sampling, etc. If you feel as a QE that you can satisfy all of those requirements by use of a borescope or other mechanism that may be less invasive than opening it up with a probe, you can get that acceptance prior from the building department and use that as an alternative method. The second part of that is, can you use balconies? Mm-hmm. You can, so long as you are able to satisfy the inspection requirement continuously from grade elevation all the way to the highest roof elevation. So if you have balconies or say fire escapes or another very similar type of situation to balconies where you can perform these inspections, you can, as long as you're going all the way from grade and can get up to the roof. So some of those balconies or fire escapes will end early from the tallest row of windows, and you might have a cornice or something 10 feet above you. You still need to make sure that you're inspecting from that highest balcony level all the way to the roof elevation to satisfy the grade to roof elevation. So you can do it with various ways. I see another question here, boom trucks. Mm-hmm. You can use boom trucks, you can use window washing rigs, you can use C-hook scaffolds, you can use outriggers, a variety of different methods. You can use sprat where you're actually pulling and ropes and harnessing and going down the building. All of those are acceptable as long as they meet the requirement of a continuous inspection from grade to the highest roof elevation.
We have two more questions and we have time for them. And if anybody wants to type in one or two more, please feel free. Is there a probe vertical height limit for requiring for a shed? Isn't any exterior work, permit or not, 40 feet or above requires a shed?
So that's, like I said, it's kind of a situational item. It does not necessarily require a shed because probing is investigatory and would be under the limits requiring a work permit. So it doesn't automatically trigger a shed. It obviously always triggers the adequate safety requirements. You need to be blocking off the areas below with flagmen and redirecting traffic. But it does not automatically trigger a sidewalk shed. As I discussed kind of before, there are areas that if you feel like you're going to be destabilizing the facade, or you're over heavily trafficked areas, or an egress door, that may require additional protection just based on where you are located or kind of what the condition of the facade or the material is that you're probing into. So that may trigger a sidewalk shed just to ensure that you have that protection. But the height, even over 40 feet, you can still perform probes without necessarily triggering a sidewalk shed, just as long as, all the conditions are satisfied.
People should be certain to reach out to you in PVE engineering if they want to double check all those conditions, because you're just pulling them right and left. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I will say that's a popular topic on this. Obviously, it's a big concern because there's an expense related to sidewalk sheds, and it's tough to answer as a one size fits all because it's very situational, and it's kind of a case by case basis. But it's just important to note that one doesn't always trigger the other, so it's not absolute black or white there. There's a lot of different items to consider.
Thank you. I think a different note here, Jameson. If you file a swamp, am I saying it correctly? A swamp.
Swarm. Yeah.
Thank you. For a job, can you file an amended report of SAFE once you finish the job in the same cycle, or do you have to wait for the next cycle to open up a file SAFE?
That's a great question, and you can. So if you filed the building as swarm in the 9th cycle and you finish the repairs and the 9th cycle is still open, you can absolutely file what's called a subsequent report within the same cycle to amend the 9th cycle filing status to SAFE. So you absolutely can do that, and it is recommended, especially if you finish the repairs, because what's on file and submitted to the city, they would like it to always have the most accurate and up-to-date status of the building as possible. So if you do file a swarm and finish the repairs at SAFE, not only can you do that, but I would recommend doing that. Yes.
And thank you. And I think we'll wrap up with this final question. When is a new build required to file its first inspection, and is it related to the TCO date?
Yes. So there is a chart, and I think we have it on our website, but the new build, it's a certain, whatever the date of the TCO, the temporary certificate of occupancy, whenever you get that date, it's that date that will depend or will dictate when your filing or your first filing is required on a new building. So I'm not sure if see this. I can actually pull up what those answers are very quickly here. But that is a great question, and the dates of those are seen here. You can find them on our website. But for new filing or new building filing guidelines, if the date of your first TCO kind of falls within these windows, that will give you what your initial filing window is there. So if it's even newer than this, then it kind of goes back on the last digit of your block number. And then if it's after February 21st, 2019, your first filing wouldn't be required until cycle 10.
What was that website address, please? I'm just going to put it right here in the answer so people have.
Oh, sure. This is just our pvllc.com.
Thank you, Jameson. That brings us to the end of the hour, almost spot on. And I'm very grateful for your participation in Buildings NY Unlocked and for this very crucial update on the new cycle and new laws that are crucial to facade inspection and our local laws. Everyone, I thank you so much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Please look at Buildings NY Unlocked online for our on-demand previous sessions and for our upcoming sessions for the rest of the year. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Jameson. All the best.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.